Thank you, Abraham. My question is about channeling. And
which is about what? Which is about being in alignment.
Exactly.
Yes. Which is about blending. Which is about being tuned in, tapped in, turned on.
Yes.
Which is about allowing the broader part of you to flow through you.
Exactly.
Just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same thing.
Yeah. Well, when I go into meditation, or often even when I don't go into meditation, I have the feeling of a presence within me and communicating to me.
Well, there is always a reason for it, because nothing that is non-physical ever comes uninvited. In other words, even with this nice man who owned this restaurant that flowed through Esther to answer Jerry's questions, he was invited. Jerry was sitting right in the middle of his restaurant asking very personal questions.
Okay. And there may be, that I'm having some kind of thing going on in my life that I question perhaps, or that, I want the answers to. And yes, that you're correct. That's
so what
when
is the
happens.
Nature of your question?
Okay, the question is, there's times I feel uncomfortable. I don't know, I don't trust it. And what I wanted to know from you is like, what do you think? Since my understanding is that you see the greater picture of me.
Well,
what is it?
As Esther began receiving us in the beginning, she often would say, Abraham, I want to speak clearly your words. In fact, she says it at the beginning of every segment. That is what she holds in her mind as she relaxes to allow us forward. Mm-hmm. And she had the advantage of Jerry, who was asking the questions, so Esther could get into the allowing mode and allow the answers to flow forward. It's not an easy thing to ask a question, which often is from your place of knowing what you don't want, and then achieve enough vibrational alignment with who you are to receive a clear answer. And that's why sometimes you feel uncomfortable. Sometimes you have still so activated the question, which is from the place of lack, that you really aren't a good match to the receiving of the answer because you're so caught up in the question. So if you have the advantage of having someone else who can sit in with you, then you could ask them to ask the question, and you could get into the receiving mode, and we think you would find it to be more comfortable. Or you could allow more time between your posing of the question and your receiving of the answer. Because remember, there are 3 steps. Step 1 is ask. Mm-hmm. Step 2 is source will answer. That's what we're talking about here. But step 3 is you must be in vibrational alignment before you can allow that answer to come forth. So our encouragement is that you just do it more often and make a decision as you allow this experience to expand more and more within you, that you're not going to try hard to make it happen. Just let it happen. There are so many who are so eager that once they get their boat turned in that direction, they want to put a motor on it and speed toward that. And so then they force it in a way that is awkward and uncomfortable and sometimes distorted. Where if you will just let your experience be about posing the questions, and you will hold yourself in this gentle attitude that the answers always flow. And more important, they always flow at the time of your greatest receptivity. And then your attitude is, I don't know exactly when I will receive the answer here, but I know I will. And then at the appropriate time, meaning at the time that you are most in alignment and ready to allow it to happen, the answer will flow. And there will come a time that you will have no doubt whatsoever about what's going on. When there is doubt present, it's almost always because you've got 1 foot in the question mode and 1 foot in the answer mode, and then it's awkward.
Can you help me to understand what the feeling is that I have in the back of my back? I feel like there's an entering of an energy.
Well, that's the way you're translating it. We want you to know that, and you get that idea because you think that who's entering is up there, and so it's logical that it would come in from the top, not from your toe.
But then it moves my head.
Here's what we want you to realize. Okay. We want you to realize that the energy is actually accessing you through every cell in your body and beyond. In other words, we can't even find an accurate enough word to talk about the primary part of your being through which the energy is entering, so to speak. It's happening on a cellular level. So when you have sensation in some part of your body, Esther remembers as she was beginning to receive Abraham, and in the beginning, she was clearing her mind of any thought that would come because she thought they were her own thoughts. And so she would just breathe deeply and try to breathe them away. And so we realized that if she was going to come to a conscious awareness that we were chatting with her, we were going to have to make it more obvious. And so we began moving her head. And we want you to understand that it is not an uncommon thing at all. Every one of you in this room right now has had the experience, even today, of being so in alignment with Source that Source was the one that projected the impulse for you to move. You keep thinking that anything that happens to me in this physical body is me and my mind making it happen. And we want you to understand that you've had this seamless integration between physical self and non-physical self forever, for longer than you have even been in this physical body. It's just the natural thing. So when you have an impulse to slow down on the highway, that often is coming from that broader view. When you have an impulse to sneeze or to cough, that often is coming from that broader view. In other words, your impulses are often directed from broader perspective, from that perspective of broader view and all-knowing.
Well, there's one particular energy that I feel coming to me, and I feel like a really loving presence, and it's automatically my head is being tilted towards one side, and I feel some kind of heart connection.
But it's a wonderful thing. And why do you need to identify it, and how could we give it a label that would be really meaningful? In other words, you're wanting to call it somebody I know from physical. Is this some dead friend of mine who is assisting? And we say, call it your inner being, call it Source, call it infinite intelligence, call it Source energy.
But that was my other question. Is that what you would call my higher self communicating, or is that like an Abraham communicating to me?
Well, there is very little difference between the terminology of the two. In other words, Esther's inner being, or higher self, if you want to call it that, or soul, is certainly among that collective consciousness that is the larger vibrating group of Abraham. But you would be very hard-pressed to distinguish the difference between Esther's inner being and Abraham, and between Abraham and that which you call God. In other words, it's Source energy, and it is a stream of energy that does not require the distinction that man keeps wanting to place upon it.
Okay, so it could not be a not benevolent energy? It could only be a good energy?
Well, when you are describing it in the way you are, in other words, every thought you've ever thought still exists, and certainly because no thoughts ever go away, and because all things continue to expand, and so things that are wanted expand, things that are not wanted expand, and so there have been plenty of thoughts thought from the human perspective of man's mind that have been about pushing against things or about things unwanted, and as law of attraction causes a gathering of those thoughts, there are what you might feel as very hefty streams of that sort of energy, but they are not Source energy. In other words, when we talk about this stream, we're talking about the perspective from non-physical, and it is a loving energy. It is pure positive energy. So we're not saying to you that it isn't possible that you could pick up on some... Esther was on an airplane one day after being fascinated by Nicole Brown Simpson's murder, and she received some energy that was around that. And we teased her about it because she was offended. She said, Abraham, you said when people die, they're only pure positive energy. And this was not pure positive energy. And we said, look at the magazines you've been reading. Look at what you've activated within your vibration. Okay. So you had access to the streams of thoughts as millions of people around the planet were focused and speculating. And so it's possible that you can pick up on anything, but we want you not to worry about it. We want your attention to be upon releasing resistance and going with the flow. And we want you to get in such a habit of reaching for the best feeling thought that you can find from where you are, that you just naturally begin to fall into that rhythm. there were many people that came to Esther in the early days of her receiving us who warned her, who said, you need to do all kinds of protective things. You need to hold protective crystals in your pocket and wear things around your neck because you need to find some way to protect yourself from the bad ones. And Esther said to us, Abraham, what do you think about this? And we said, not at all. Nothing do we think about that. In other words, we do not turn our attention to that, and we do not encourage you to turn your attention to it either, because everything you shout no at, you're actually shouting yes at it, you see. And so there isn't anything for you to worry about. Just relax and get into the best feeling place that you can and allow the broader part of you to flow through you in a meaningful way.
And I also have another question. I don't remember consciously really asking for that to happen.
Well, do you remember raising your hand to come to this chair?
Yeah, now
well, it's
asking,
sort of like that.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
In other words, there are a lot of people in this room who won't sit in the chair today,
okay.
But your asking was very clear to us.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Questions.
Our one answer should fit all of them.